Thank you very much, Peter. And I hope that you are not tired of hearing about the United States. In the previous session, we mainly focused on the challenge of the next elections. But before we go to that, we're still in the term of the Biden administration. So let's talk a little bit about the approach of the Biden administration and the grand strategy of the US, if there is a grand strategy. So Tom, let's move straight to business. You know, in your pre-National Security Council days, you wrote a little bit about the great power competition, about the changes in international system. It's been also a key feature for the Biden administration. But I think one of the ideas, especially at the beginning, was this idea that we are in the great power competition, but this could be basically a responsible competition, especially between China and the US, avoiding certain things. We also heard about the guardrails to the relationship with Russia. We are right now in a slightly different positions, let's put it like this. So my question would be, what's this competition about? What should be the end state? Is it about competing, or is it maybe about winning? And in the last session, we heard a lot about the US fatigue in terms of leadership in the global scale, in terms of engaging with the world. Does the US still have the stomach to do this major power competition?
So thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I've learned a lot from the panels already today and from Elliot's speech last night. So just firstly on the premise of your question and great power competition, and as you noted, I used to write about this before I joined. I mean, we see it every single day and every single week. I think we see it obviously with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We see it in the Indo-Pacific. We see it on the domestic front. I think for us, two things are very, very clear: that we are in an era, in the early stages of an era of strategic competition with China and Russia, and potentially other sort of like-minded countries with them. And then we also face these common sort of challenges that we need to address. We need to mobilize sort of collective action internationally. And I think how we fare, in our administration will be determined by the extent to which we can sustain competitive advantages, in that strategic competition and mobilize that collective action. And I think that that pops up all the time. I'm a bit sort of surprised to hear sort of the fatigue point, because I think if you just look at the last let's just take the last 4 or 5 months since the beginning of this year, and what we've seen the formal launch of AUKUS. We've seen a trilateral agreement with the ROK, with South Korea, Japan, and the United States, an agreement with South Korea on extended deterrence, and President Yoon's trip to Washington, a deep sort of technological agreement I set with India that I think will be backed up when Modi visits Washington next month. We've seen Finland, of course, joining NATO on a wide array of areas. I think we've seen a deepening of alliances and partnerships, not just in terms of better meetings and better summits, but real material improvements in the collective position of the allies sort of internationally. We are, I think, systematically improving the country and the alliance's strategic position internationally. I forgot to mention the Japan piece and their investment in counter-strike capabilities, real meaningful sort of burden sharing on the international stage. And then there's a domestic sort of angle to this too that I think, for many years, because we are sort of trapped in this sort of old post-war, post-Cold War sort of paradigm, there was this sense that the market would sort of take care of itself, particularly when it came to the national security piece of it. And we had real work to do in the technological sphere to make sure we were making the investments in foundational technologies that will be absolutely vital to this long-term strategic competition. And we've seen real bipartisan moves in Washington through the CHIPS and Science Act and in other ways to really invest in those technologies. So I think when people look back, on this period, I hope they will they will take note of all of these sort of concrete actions that are being put in place to really build sort of a new, situation of strength in what we're in this year into which we're entering.
That is indeed an impressive list, and we should probably feel reassured. But I would submit to you that on the bottom of most of these relationships is the power of the United States in the military sphere, in the economic sphere, in the other sphere. And we are, of course, watching the strengthening of the alliance and partnership systems, but we are also watching the discussions in the United States about the prioritization. The idea that the United States maybe is doing too much, but also that the United States cannot do everything, especially the prioritization between the Indo-Pacific theater and the European theater. So can you perhaps walk us through some of these crucial strategic choices or the trade-offs, actual trade-offs or potential trade-offs in terms of how much attention and how much resources could be devoted to particular issues? And even more explicitly, this idea that you're either supporting Ukraine or you are supporting Taiwan. And some voices I hear that are claiming that supporting too much Ukraine would somehow weaken the hand of the United States when it comes to Indo-Pacific. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say on the Taiwan versus Ukraine sort of argument that I think we hear from not that many people actually, but I think they are relatively vocal. I think the first thing I would say is that is certainly not the view of our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. Like, they do not believe that our support for Ukraine weakens our position in the Indo-Pacific. Quite the contrary, and I think we'll see this at the G7 this weekend. Japan, Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, very explicitly are all very clear that Putin cannot be allowed to succeed in Ukraine. And they have all, I think, they are all cooperating and supporting Ukraine in a variety of different ways. They are supportive of our effort and of Europe's effort to help Ukraine. So I think they understand that actually there is not a zero-sum trade-off. I would also say in our own, strategic thinking on this, we are stronger in Europe because of our relationships in the Indo-Pacific, and we are stronger in the Indo-Pacific because of our relationships in Europe. And I would add sort of the Middle East into that too, because our sort of global network of alliances and partnerships is actually a strategic asset, not a liability. And it helps us that Europe is interested and involved and engaged in the Indo-Pacific, even if there's not 100% alignment all of the time. The fact that we are sort of liberal democracies working together with similar sets of values and interests that are largely compatible, gives us additional strength there. So I think if we were to sort of conceive of this as, we can't do very much in Ukraine, because we need to focus on Taiwan, that would be a very, very short-sighted, mindset. That I think if Russia was allowed to succeed in that case, in Ukraine, I think the consequences would not just be, catastrophic for Ukraine, and I think for Europe, but also I think it would send a terrible message sort of internationally that right makes right, and it would also signal to Europe why should they be bothered about what happens in Taiwan or in the Indo-Pacific. And the final point I would just make, Lucas, and I heard this mentioned earlier in terms of the defense industrial base, and sometimes this comes up in terms of trade-offs. We inherited a situation, I think, where there was real issues in the defense industrial base, particularly regarding munitions. The war, I think, has served as a wake-up call. This is a matter that gets a huge amount of attention and focus in terms of fixing that so it can deliver the type of capabilities that we needed to over the medium to long term. Our position in the Indo-Pacific is better off today, I think, because of the improvements that have been made in the defense industrial base, right? And we are learning from this conflict in Ukraine, we are from the war, we are learning the deficiencies that existed, how to address those. And so I think we will sort of emerge, collectively stronger, as a result. And I think it's incredibly, the final thing I would say is that if we are to ask our allies and partners to do more, we find that that's more likely to happen when we have honest and frank conversations and when we are also doing more, like we are also engaged sort of fully in doing what we can, not sort of pulling back and say, we have to do less and then, you need to take on more of the burden.
Let me still pressure you a little bit because still, the time and attention and resources, especially of the top decision makers, is a scarce commodity. So I'm reading your comments as a way of saying, we can actually manage all of it. And I can see it when it comes to Russia and its aggression against Ukraine and some of the most acute challenges in the Indo-Pacific. But then you kind of enlarge the picture a little bit, and in the Middle East, it seems that the US is right now a little bit absent. We have another outbreak of fighting in Sudan that some people are saying is connected to a certain neglect of this region by international actors, including the US. So can you really be there for everyone at every possible time of the day and night?
Well, I do think, I think prioritization is important, right? And I think we have tried to do that, right? I think the president, when he gave the order on Afghanistan, one of the arguments for that was that we needed to turn the page from the conflicts of the post-9/11 era to prepare for the conflicts and the challenges that were, coming toward us, particularly in the area of strategic competition. Now, I don't know if anyone could have anticipated at the time how quickly that would happen in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, because that, of course, is in August of 2021. But I think that's an area where, difficult decision was taken. I think in the Middle East is what we are, seeing there is, and I think National Security Advisor spoke about this in a speech a couple of weeks ago, sort of laying out the case. But I think we inherited a situation where it's highly pressurized. I think we have supported integration in the region, de-escalation. I think we've seen progress in the Yemen war, of course, of the ceasefire. I think we've seen a number of areas where we've seen some de-escalation and steps toward a greater sort of more integrated region where we see more military and security cooperation, economic cooperation. We try to play an active role in that and being sort of engaged. Diplomatically, there are still challenges, of course, particularly with Iran that we're dealing with our allies. But I think I wouldn't describe that as disengagement. I think we've seen full sort of diplomatic, engagement. But we've also seen the need to correct the emphasis of our attention, where for almost 20 years the Middle East sort of defined our national security policy, and it was largely organized around many of the challenges there. We need to be increasingly concerned about the strategic competition with the PRC and with Russia and with those challenges. And so I think there is a natural adjustment there in terms of the investments we are making domestically and the deepening of alliances and partnerships to be ready for those challenges.
Let me now zoom into Europe. You mentioned the strengthening of the alliances and partnership, and that included also NATO enlargement, but also internal strengthening of NATO. I would also claim the strengthening of the relationship between the United States and the European Union. And of course, the war has given us additional impetus to get closer together, and that's true on this side of the Atlantic and on your side of the Atlantic. But how do you see actually the future of a transatlantic relationship? What are your expectations regarding the Europeans? And how do you maybe harmonize these expectations with the expectations coming out of Europe? We discussed them at the previous session, and some of us present in the room laughed when the President Macron's remarks were reported. But for me, there is an element of the actual concern or the expectations that actually the Europeans would be present in the room where some of the major decisions about global strategy of the United States is being conceived. So consultation rather than the United States coming with the pre-arranged solution. But the basic question is, how do you kind of redistribute or distribute the burdens and responsibilities in a way that would be beneficial for the United States and also beneficial for the Europeans?
Yeah, I think we are seeing very significant burden sharing, in this war. I mean, I think we're here in Poland, obviously, has done so much and has invested so much, but also in its own capabilities and in the assistance to Ukraine, but also in the number of refugees that you've taken in and just the extraordinary contribution, I think, that Poland and other countries have made. I think other countries in Europe, I think, have also done sort of an immense amount. I think we have done a lot as well. I think we all do that collectively because, this is a hugely significant sort of moment. The invasion, in February of last year, I think was was a very rare sort of first order challenge to peace and stability in Europe. And so it is going to require, an enormous effort by all. So I would sort of start out by, saying that I do think that everyone is, contributing. And I think we will, of course, have ongoing, conversations about exactly what that means and what country gives what and how to ensure, those are, backfilled appropriately and, people's sort of individual sort of interests and security concerns are taken into account, and all of that. But we're very much still, in the middle of this, I think. And our, focus throughout has been, how do we work toward our objective of a free and independent and sovereign Ukraine with the ability to defend itself and to deter future attack. And so that is our goal. I think that's the goal of the alliance as a whole. I think there's questions then after the conflict, in terms of, the future relationship with Ukraine and, architecture in Europe and all of that, I think, that are also sort of significant, but, and we are, spending time on as well. But obviously, right now, I think that the primary focus is helping Ukraine.
I suggest that we still, since we are on the deck of this strategic arc, then we, of course, focus on the immediate challenge, but we also not losing sight of this broader perspective. And one of the issue here, at least for me, is this question of, how is the relationship between the United States and Europe evolve in the future in terms of kind of responsibility, sovereignty, or autonomy, if you want to use these terms, because for some, the U.S. position may seem a little bit schizophrenic. That on the one hand, we hear encouragement of Europeans taking more responsibility in their own hands and being stronger, but then sometimes there is also this feeling that if certain European leaders push too hard, then there's always comes this warning that please do not violate the sanctity of the transatlantic relations. So what does especially the Biden administration wants out of Europe? To be more independent, to be stronger, to be in sync with the US approach? How does it work?
Yeah, look, I think we've moved beyond those debates a little bit, especially with the war, because I think the war has sort of underscored, that everybody needs to be, fully engaged and working together. And I'm not trying to sort of be coy or evade the question, but if you take sort of independence or autonomy or whatever you would call it, I mean, the question would be, well, how exactly, would that be sort of different in terms of what Europe would do? Because I don't see sort of fundamental differences of approach in terms of how to help Ukraine and how to push back and impose costs, on Russia. So I think we're very comfortable with Europe, increasing its own capability and playing a greater role because we, understand from our, consultations and from our, alliance that we're all sort of pushing in the same direction. We don't think that means that we can do less or pull back. We are very committed, as well. So I think that the war sort of underscores the commonality of the approach, in a way, and that sometimes these labels can sort of, get in the way of sort of realizing that, that we're not actually in fundamentally different places. I think we've been supportive since the beginning of the European Union, in contrast maybe to the previous, administration of seeing the EU as a key sort of partner. So I think we're comfortable with that too. Of course, I think all the efforts that are made to improve capability need to, need to work in a way that sort of, maximizes efficiency and doesn't sort of duplicate things. I don't think there's much sort of danger, of that. So I see some of those older debates as a little bit of a distraction from some of the actual, questions that we have, that we are facing. For instance, after countries have contributed so much, how do we sort of address the issues in the defense industrial base to ensure that, countries can get sort of, can rebuild their stockpiles and, rebuild their capabilities going forward? How can we do that across the Atlantic in a way that, that doesn't, that we don't see one effort sort of undermining the other, right? That they're compatible with each other. How do we think about that long-term relationship with Ukraine? So I think those are all the more sort of pertinent questions that we're.
So it looks better in practice than it does on Twitter feed sometimes.
Maybe a little bit, yeah.
But of course, if we go into the details on some of the things, then we would need to discuss also some of the diverging interests, for example, when it comes to the purchase and development of military equipment. Do you do it with the US? Do we do it as the Europeans? But that's probably the topic for another conversation. We, I think, have time for one short question. So if we can go in the first row.
You have two beside each other.
Very short one. Maida.
Thank you, Tom. Just a quick one. Could you tell us what percentage of your meetings are on Ukraine and what percentage on Taiwan?
Is Steve, I want to, or?
Maybe you can start with this one.
Right, okay. I can't put an exact number on it, but I would say, the war, I think, is, takes up an enormous amount of time, obviously for all of us, I think. And the Indo-Pacific, I think, I wouldn't sort of just confine it to China, because I think it's sort of a mistake just to, because we're obviously trying to build our alliances and partnerships in the region, not just because of China, but also because, we believe it's the right thing to do anyway. I think what I would say is safe to say is that those two buckets of issues, I think, are that is the bulk of my job personally.
Apologies to Steve, but I want to give the opportunity for someone who didn't share the previous session. So who can attract my attention over there? Yes.
Patty Morrissey from the United States of America. I guess as an American, that previous panel was a bit disturbing. No offense, just because you were talking about reality, Steve. But was wondering, Tom, if you thought there would be an acceleration or a ramping up of the education process for the American public about what's at stake here. Because we had some really great presentations last night and this morning about what's at stake here. And people seem to get it. And I just want to, just real quickly, my husband texted me something that an American soldier fighting in Ukraine had stated about what's at stake. And he said, sorry, just a second.
Maybe you can skip that part.
Real quick, Ukraine is where democracy-loving free peoples are coming from all countries to make our final stand against brutal, kleptocratic authoritarians. So, if we believe that, which I do, is there an initiative we can take in the United States to strengthen people's understanding of what's at stake?
Can I maybe just expand this question a little bit? Because one of the features of the Biden administration was to make the foreign policy that would be attractive to the average American or the American middle class. So can American middle class be persuaded by the argument that this is a final stand against the tyranny of the world?
Look, I think this is it's a very important question, and I think we see a lot of bipartisan support for our foreign policy. I mean, there's differences, of course, and politics is politics, and people will make, criticisms, all the time, and they do. But when you look at the details of it, right, on Ukraine, there's been overwhelming support in the Congress for various supplementals on Ukraine. Some of the voices that are very critical or want to get out and focus on Taiwan or just get out of everywhere, they may be pretty vocal, but they're not that numerous, actually, when you look at the overall debate and discussion. So I feel pretty good, about the domestic basis of support for Ukraine. And I think when you look in allied and partner countries too, there were also political debates there, but for the most part, there's very strong support also. Now, if you broaden out and look at what we've been doing, on China, some of the things I mentioned earlier, AUKUS, ETCA with the Philippines, the stuff with Japan, all of that, hugely popular, and not seen as in any way partisan in any way, shape, or form. The domestic steps that were taken in Chips and Science Act and semiconductors and investing in key technologies. Again, strong bipartisan support for a new form of industrial policy, some differences on aspects of clean tech and other things, and the Inflation Reduction Act, but for the most part, again, strong support. So I think when we zoom out a little bit from the sort of day-to-day and from the cable news, debates, I think what you see is it's a decent amount of continuity, actually, and a recognition, a very widespread recognition that we are entering into a new era. This is different than the post-9/11 era. It's one in which we have to be very attentive to domestic strengths and investing in the domestic part of foreign policy. Parties may have slightly different ideas about how to do that, but no one really fundamentally disputes that premise, a recognition that we do need to be working more closely with allies and partners, and again, on support for Ukraine. So I don't want to be too Pollyannish about it, but I actually don't sort of see that fatigue. I don't, if you accept, the previous president from the conversation, which I know you can't, on it, I think he is obviously very unique and strong views, but I think that the rest of it actually, it's really striking how much, consensus is probably the wrong word, but how much overlap there actually is. And I think that does give me, a strong sense of optimism.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we needed optimism after discussing the Trump apocalypse and various other challenges at the previous session. So many thanks, Tom, for providing us with this fresh air of optimism and confidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you.